not true, is it? Because economic blocs have a bigger currency value compared to even the strongest of economies. So naturally, China will want to join these economic blocs because it's just beneficial for them.
Thank you, sir. These blocs have huge currencies because of the big countries that have strong currencies, not more because of the small countries like Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, all that stan countries. So yeah, that's my response. Second level of analysis. My second level of analysis on why economic independence is important. Now we think that without economic independence or sovereignty, you cannot draft your own monetary policies. Now, why is it important that you draft your own monetary policies? It is so that you can avoid financial crisis. Because when you have your own monetary policies, you can quickly draft or you can quickly decide your interest rates to actually suit it or appropriate it to your country's economical system. You can also control inflation because now you have a body which, when you are not in a union, you can control your own fiscal deficit. And on the other side, they told us specifically that there is nobody that controls the fiscal policies of a country. We think that's harmful. We think that will affect the entirety of the countries that are using the same union. But my third level of analysis on how, if they create an Asian union where you can move freely, that wouldn't work. Because number one, that would require all Asian countries to open up borders. We think that's impossible. All the Asian countries would not want to open up their borders. Maybe some do, but some wouldn't. But secondly, how are you going to deal with constrictions such as language and cultural differences? Yeah, you can deal it in the European Union because they typically have the same kind of language, more economic interests and similar culture and language. But that's impossible for 48 Asian countries where you have a diverse amount of people and culture. So all in all, ladies and gentlemen, I have disproven on how their side can actually create a sustainable currency which is used by the entirety of Asian unions. Before I take a seat, I have one thing to say. Let's be realistic, not idealistic. Thank you.
Thank you, Nazmi. Well, the opposition leader has made his point. Without further delay, let us invite the second minister from the government, Kamara Azli bin Kamaruzaman, to counter the opposition's arguments.
Post-Cold War Europe was fractured. Europe cannot, like nations like Lithuania or nations like Austria, couldn't trade with bigger nations like France or Germany because there exists a financial barrier between them. The problem now in status quo, it exists in Asian worlds like China, or how nations like Timor-Leste couldn't even trade with nations like China because there exists a very high currency inflation within Timor-Leste to begin with. But before I continue, Assalamualaikum and a very pleasant day I bid to wise panel of adjudicators, accurate timekeepers, worthy opponents, comrades, and last but not least, members of the floor. I'll do two things. I'll rebut every single problematic idea that came from first speaker. I'll give out my positive materials. Number one, leader of opposition failed to understand our mechanism to begin with, because he wanted to say these very poor nations like all these Kazakhstans or Tajikistans and so on and so forth would belittle the bloc or diminish the power and influence the bloc has upon the economy. But they failed to understand that under my prime minister's mechanism, we already told you that we want nations who cannot fulfill the requirements like price stability or exchange rate stabilities wouldn't even be accepted in the bloc to begin with. It's something that they failed to understand, something that they didn't want to engage with in the first place. These nations would most likely be nations like China, like nations like Japan, Malaysia, India, all these nations with stable price stability that is necessarily better than all these stans nations. Not yet. But now, what's the problem from leader of opposition? He wanted to shove words down our throat. We didn't say anything about creating a union, creating a union that enforces this sort of things, forces nations to open borders, to accept people. And to begin with, we aren't saying that nations have to accept like the language barriers or have to face the language barriers. We're proposing an idea of a unified economy, not a unified nation to begin with. This is the problem that came from their side. Maybe they failed to listen, maybe they didn't understand what my first speaker told them. Not yet. Now, the second thing, they wanted to argue, then what's the incentive for bigger nations to opt into this in the first place? Like I explained, when smaller nations opt into this common currency idea, the value of that currency increases. The moment in which the value of that currency increases, like bigger nations like China could be threatened by the community of Asian nations coming together with a common currency. Let's say like 37 nations within Asia uses the common currency. The value of the Chinese yuan would decrease, wouldn't be as strong as it was before, because there exists another strong power block within the world, something that they fail to understand. But before I continue, I'll let you defend yourself.
If you reduce economic sovereignty of certain countries, would that harm the country itself?
Look, the central bank doesn't enforce fiscal policies. It only forces monetary policies. They cannot say this Asian central bank would enforce austerity measures upon these nations to begin with. That's assumptions coming from them, because we didn't say anything at all about austerity measures or fiscal policies to begin with. Now, continuing towards my argumentations. Number one, how the specialization of economy and how it benefits Asian nations in general. Let me give you a bit of context. In status quo, there exists the multiplicity of producers that produce the same products, but with different prices. For example, like Malaysia produces rice, Thailand also produces rice, but the value of Thai rice is cheaper compared to Malaysia. But the problem that exists under that world is people opt into Malaysian rice more because they believe in the currency of the Malaysian ringgit, because they see that the Malaysian ringgit is much more stable than the Thai baht to begin with. This is the problem that happens for these smaller nations like Thailand, which we cannot, since they are considered a big producer of rice, these individuals cannot benefit the most, since the selling or the trade is split into two between Malaysia and Thailand. This is something that we want to solve. Smaller nations wouldn't necessarily want to opt into this because of the benefits that is produced. Now, secondly, what happens when these nations adopt this common currency thing? Nations like Thailand will benefit the most, since most people would opt into buying rice from Thailand, therefore leading to a production increase of the Thai rice, therefore increasing the demand. Now what happens when demand of Thai rice increases? It leads to the principle of economics of scale. Therefore, the maximization of production or the maximization of production of factories will happen now, because in status quo itself, Thailand doesn't produce to the maximum extent of the rice that it could produce, because it's challenged by the Malaysian rice to begin with. This is something that these nations face. This is something that's problematic, and I don't understand why they wanted to say how nations don't have the incentive to do so. Because if at the end of the day these nations get a higher sort of revenue from the production of rice, then therefore it's logical for us to say that any nation would want to opt into it in the first place. But the second idea is the third level of analysis on how we liberate the market. Let's understand this problem. The liberalization of market does not exist in status quo. Let me give you an example. The import of foreign cars within Malaysia is something that's problematic in today's world, because foreign cars are taxed upon very high, and to the point in which people are disincentivized to buy these imported cars to begin with, because the idea of the national interest that they wanted to defend. This would lead to the citizens not having the choice to begin with, because it's something that is just very expensive in the first place. Now, what happens when the common currency is placed? Therefore, it would mean that it would mean that there exists this there would exist this reason as to why they would they would like lessen the taxes placed upon these cars in the first place due to the specialization of economy, because nations would have to specialize and find something that they're good at to begin with. Like things like Proton would, even if Proton were to die at the end of the day, we're okay with it, because if at the end of the day it leads to individuals having a choice of what they want to buy in the first place, if it also leads to individuals specializing in something that would lead to the maximization of production of these nations to begin with. What have I told you? I've told you their problematic understanding of our mechanism, why they fail to understand every single thing. I've answered how they want to protect national interest to begin with. I've also told you why nations would even opt into this due to the benefits that they can receive at the end of the day. With that, I'm proud to propose.
Thank you, Kamara Azli, for the points put forth. Now, let us invite the second speaker from the opposition, Ahmad Zaki Aiman bin Ali Rahman, to counter the government's argument.
Ladies and gentlemen, we won't harm the poor country. At the same time, we won't harm the rich country. So this clearly shows that we are not equal at the same time, but we actually fight for equity. So if you want to propose something towards the other country, you need to propose it physically. But before I continue furthermore in my speech today, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, Assalamualaikum, and a very good morning to the wise educator, handsome timekeeper, worthy opponents, my loyal teammates, not to forget, members of the House. So today in my speech, have three components. My first component, I will rebut points that have been given by the Deputy Leader of Government. And then second, I will present my argumentation. And lastly, I will summary my speech today. So let's move on to my first component. I'll show you what's the loopholes coming from the opposition sides, and I'll rebut everything that been stated by the second minister of the government. So just now, they say that, in our world, in the status quo, some country fail to sell their goods because their currency are high compared to the other country. So we don't see this as a problem, because we cannot burden every single Asian country to because of these simple excuses. This is not fair for the other country who are going to be affected by the harms that have been promoted by this policy, where we're going to make the currency the same, the Asian currency the same. So we believe that this is not rational, and at the first place, the government side failed to give a deeper analyze it properly, and we doesn't see that they spend a sufficient time to analyze this point. So secondly, under their word, they say that, if we change the currency, these people will face some benefit at all whatsoever. So we believe that even if we change the currency of this poor country, we believe that at the end of the day, this country still poor, this country still fail to encounter the other country, this country still fail to do the trade, because they are poor country, ladies and gentlemen. Whatever you do at the first place, they are poor, so then nothing really changed under their world. So we believe that their paradigm benefit is not really realistic. And we believe that under their world, they fail to prove to us how does that happen in the first place. They didn't give us sufficient time to explain that thing. No, thank you, still early. So, I know we believe that the second minister presented a very, very vague case at the first place, and they didn't give us enough analysis, and we believe that under their world, we cannot believe that because it's totally vague and fake. So, let's move on to my second component, which is my argument. My argument is, I explain to you how does changing the currency will bring more harm than good. So, in my argument, I have three analyses. My first analysis, adverse effect, under the keyword adverse effect on a certain country. My second analysis is about how their policy didn't empower the Asian country, and the last analysis will be one loss affects everyone. So let's move on to my first analysis. But before that, sure, defend yourself.
Nations with like cheaper labor costs would attract like bigger companies to opt into them. When the moment in which like the currency is all equal within the Asian nations, therefore people would want to open factories within nations like Indonesia because of the cheap labor cost to begin with and the equal amount of pay that they can provide.